Sorry, we had a problem with overheating here. Yes. Well, this is just great. What's the other people, when they see the movement or experience the movement, they cannot associate with the same way because it's moving differently. And they will not activate Fred's or Jill's motor system. It can therefore be seen that movements that are more similar to one's own movement are more likely to result in motor resonance, that is Fred and Jill's movements, than those that are dissimilar, e.g. Fred's and George's movement. The argument that movement similarity boosts motor resonance is not merely theoretical. Various laboratories have tested this hypothesis. For example, Cross et al. Trained expert dancers to learn complex whole-body dance sequences that were not in their motor repertoire prior to training. They found that motor system activity during passive observation of videoed dance sequences co-varied as a function of the observer's ability to execute the dance move. Greater activity was seen for movements that the dancer had mastered. Thus, motor resonance increased as participants' own movements became increasingly similar to the videoed movements. C. The importance of being similar. Repercussions for socio-cognitive processes. As discussed in paragraph 3b, movements that are similar to one's own movement are more likely to result in a motor resonance. A number of studies suggest that a byproduct of this motor resonance is the facilitation of various socio-cognitive functions, including action perception, prediction, interpretation, and imitation. This point is illustrated here with various examples from the literature. 1. Movement similarity and action perception. Casil and Giese used motor training to ascertain the contribution of movement similarity to perception. Participant learned a novel upper body movement while blindfolded, meaning that they received verbal and haptic but not visual feedback. Before and after the training, point light stimuli were used to test the visual recognition of the learned movement. Despite the absence of visual stimulation during training, participants demonstrated an enhanced ability to visually recognize the trained movement. Furthermore, visual recognition performance after training correlated strongly with the accuracy of the execution of the learned movement. Thus, the more similar a participant executed movements were to the observed movement, the better their visual recognition performance. 2. Movement similarity and action prediction. Agliotti et al. Demonstrated that professional basketball players could predict the success of free shots at a basket earlier and more accurate than individuals with comparable visual experience, coaches or sports journalists, but reduced motor experience. Moreover, Agliotti and colleagues found that only basketball players showed time-specific motor activation during observation of erroneous shots. They suggest that individuals who can move more similarly to the observed stimuli, i.e. basketball players, are more successful in their prediction, and that results are a function of enhanced motor resonance. 3. Movement similarity and the mental state of confidence. This is important. Theoretical accounts predict that motor similarity should promote mental state inference. Patel et al. Tested this hypothesis with respect to a particular mental state, confidence. In an initial execution condition, participants performed visual discrimination tasks wherein they successively view two images, one a target and one a foil. Participant indicated whether the first or the second image contained the target by picking up a marble and placing it appropriately in the appropriately labeled slot, and subsequently relate their confidence in their decision. In this phase of the experiment, increasing confidence was associated with faster movements. In an ensuing observation task, participants watch a series of video clips showing the hands of anonymized actors performing the execution task and judge how confident they consider the actor to be. Patel and colleagues found that participants' judgment depended upon their own movement speed in the execution condition. If a participant watched an actor who moved faster than themselves, then they were more likely to rate this actor as being confident. Whereas movement performed slower than a participant's own movements were more likely to be rated as low in confidence. Participants were therefore more likely to accurately estimate confidence for movements that were similar in speed to their own movements. Four, movement similarity and behavioral imitation. Kellner et al. Demonstrated that behavioral imitation of observed movements is greater for movements that are similar to one's own. Kellner et al. Tracked participants' arm movement while they executed vertical sinusoidal arm waving movements. Simultaneously, participants watched a video of an actor making incongruent horizontal movements. This video was experimentally manipulated such that the arm moved either with typical human kinematics in a smooth, fluid manner or at a constant velocity like a traditional robot. They found that observing videos of a person moving with human kinematics interfered with participants' ongoing actions such that they subtly imitated the observed movements. By contrast, there were no subtle sign of imitation for the constant velocity movements. Thus, imitation was enhanced for movements that were similar to the participants' own movements relative to the movements that were dissimilar. 5. Movement similarity and positive effect. Movement similarity has been associated with positive effect. For example, Kirsch et al. Found that participants reported greater enjoyment and interest when observing dance movements from within their own motor repertoire, and associated body of literature suggests that behavior correlates of motor resonance such as movement synchronicity and automatic imitation may be intrinsically rewarding. For instance, Hove and Ryson demonstrated that participants who tapped synchronously with an experimenter like the experimenter more than participant who tapped asynchronously. Wow. Let me read that again. For instance, Hove and Ryson demonstrated that participants who tapped synchronously with an experiment liked the experimenter more than participants who tapped asynchronously. They argue that synchronicity of movements between interactants can promote the development of positive attitudes. Similarly, numerous studies have demonstrated that being imitated increases positive evaluations of interactions. And after being imitated, people are more helpful, increase the amount they donate to charity, and feel closer to others. Thus, a number of studies support the notion that movement similarity and behavioral correlates of motor resonance, such as movement synchronicity and automatic imitation, promote positive affect. 6. How important is motor resonance? The literature described in paragraph 3, 1 to 5, shows that compared with people who move in dissimilar ways, people who move in similar ways will probably experience more fluid action, perception, and prediction, be better at estimating each other's mental states, be more likely to imitate each other, and be more inclined to develop positive affective ties to each other. It is possible that these diverse benefits of motor similarity are all due to enhanced motor resonance. However, such effects may also be mediated by a visual experience route. To illustrate, imagine you have had a well-spent afternoon mastering the art of balancing a teaspoon on the tip of your finger. In doing so, you have learned that success is associated with a particular pattern of muscle contractions. Now imagine your friend attempts this complex balancing act. After watching only their initial body positioning, you successfully predict that the teaspoon will fall. According to the motor resonance account, observing your friend's initial positioning activates the corresponding motor codes within your system, generating a forward model that is a prediction of sensory consequences of the pattern of muscle contractions, from which you can predict the predicted probability of success. However, while mastering the art of teaspoon balancing, in addition to motor experience, you also receive visual experience. For example, you may have learned that the sight of your finger being at a particular angle relative to the ground and a certain distance from your body is highly predictive of success. If your motor system were temporarily lesioned, you would still be able to use this visual experience to estimate your friend's chance of success. Thus, both motor and visual experiences are important in our processing of others' actions. For many of the studies discussed above, it has been empirically demonstrated that motor resonance adds predictive power over and above that, contributed by the visual system alone. However, when thinking about the repercussions of movement atypicalities in clinical populations, it is important to remember that if an individual tends to move differently compared with typical individuals, they will have both different motor and visual experience of actions. Summary. Whether due to the natural development of the movements throughout their lifetime or intense target training, e.g. dance classes, people who move similar to each other will have comparable motor and visual experiences. Conversely, motor and visual experience is less comparable for individuals who move differently. Further, similar motor and visual experiences appear to facilitate socio-cognitive processes, including action perception, prediction, estimation of mental states, imitation, and the development of positive affective ties. Thus, these processes are probably enhanced for people that move similarly and relatively impaired for those who do not. 4. Atypical movements and socio-cognitive function in autism. In 1996, Lear and Hill published a controversial comment on the autism literature. They suggested that autism research had virtually ignored movement atypicalities, instead focusing on social and communicative problems. They argued that social descriptions of behavior such as a failure to cuddle, socially inappropriate gestures, and an indifference to affection could be recast in terms of neurological motor symptoms such as abnormal posture and tone, dyskinesia, and marked underactivity. Critically, they asserted that the application of social context to motor behaviors diverts attention from the possible neurological explanations and thus hinders appropriate treatment interventions. Although Leary and Hill's focus concerned social interaction, actions and reactions that occur between people, they also commented on social cognition, internal processes relating to the perception, prediction, and interpretation of others. Here's a quote. Many individuals who experience movement disturbance report differences in internal mental processes, such as perception, changes in attention, consciousness, motivation, and emotion. Sections 2 and 3 summarize the literature demonstrating that autistic individuals move differently from typical individuals, and argue that socio-cognitive tasks such as perceiving, predicting, and interpreting others may be made more difficult between people who move differently compared with those who move similarly. This section elaborates on Leary and Hill's comment by making the case that, at least in part due to movement differences, autistic individuals may have difficulties in perceiving, predicting, and interpreting the actions of typical individuals. Conversely, typical individuals may have difficulties perceiving, predicting, and interpreting the actions of autistic individuals. I conclude by highlighting in paragraph 4D to G outstanding questions to be addressed by research in this area. A. Movement similarity and action perception in autism. Using motion tracking technology, Koch et al. Examined the relationship between movement kinematics and action perception in autism. Adults with autism and typical individuals matched in terms of age, gender, and intelligence performed simple sinusoidal arm waving movements, while the kinematic velocity, acceleration, and jerk of the movements were recorded. Autistic individuals produced arm movements that were more jerky and which proceeded with greater acceleration and velocity than those produced by typical individuals. The magnitude of these kinematic atypicalities was significantly positively correlated with autism symptom severity as measured by the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule semi-structured questionnaire. Such results are consistent with reports from other laboratories of atypically jerky arm and whole body movements in autism. In a separate perception task, participants watched a series of visual stimuli comprising an image of a human hand that made vertical sinusoidal movements down and then up across the computer screen. The velocity profile of the hand was generated by a motion morphing between human-like minimum jerk motion and robot-like constant velocity. Participants also completed a non-biological control condition which featured a falling tennis ball, the velocity profile, which was a motion morph between gravitational motion and constant velocity. Participants were required to label the movement of the stimulus as natural or unnatural. Results show that the degree to which kinematic profiles were atypical when executing arm movements was significantly correlated with biased responding when observing motion of a human hand, but not a tennis ball. In other words, the more atypical an autistic participant's kinematics relative to kinematics exhibited by typical individuals, the less likely they were to classify movements that follow typical kinematics as natural. Such results are consistent with the conclusions of Patel et al., drawn from their studies of typical individuals in the same way that a typical observer's perception of a confident movement was modeled on their own confident movements. Autistic individuals' perception of natural movements is likely to be modeled on their own movements. Hey, hey, hey. B. Movement similarity and imitation in autism. Cataneo et al. Investigated the link between action execution and automatic imitation of others' action in children with autism and matched group of typically developing children. In an action execution condition, participants were required to pick up a piece of paper and place it in a container, or pick up a piece of food and eat it. During both actions, the activity of the mouth opening mylohyoid MH muscle was recorded using electromyography. In separate observation condition, participants passively observed a typical child pick up a piece of 1. Food and place it in their mouth, or 2. Paper and place it in a container, while activity from the MH muscle was recorded. Kitano et al. Found that during the execution condition, MH muscle activity from typical children started to increase several hundreds of milliseconds before their hand grasped the food. It continued to increase during actual grasp and reached its peak when the child started to open its mouth. MH muscle activity for autistic children was strikingly different. No activity increase was found during the entire reaching and grasping phase. The muscle only became active as the food was brought to the mouth. I'm just astonished. I had this paper in my possession for 2 years, and it was up in Sköllerstad. I produced it first time. I am just gobsmacked. This is just amazing. How could I miss this? These group differences during action execution translated into group differences during action observation. For typical children, MH activity was observed when they passively observed another child reach and grasp a piece of food. By contrast, the autistic children did not show MH activation during the observation of either reaching or grasping phases. Thus, a typical action execution in autistic children, i.e. a lack of anticipatory activation of the MH muscle when bringing food to the mouth, was associated with atypical imitative responses. C. Is the mirror neuron system broken in autism? Much of the past decade's literature concerning autism has debated the integrity of the MNS in this population. Mirror neural system. Very important. Thus, it is important to be clear about the claims made in this paper. Although the difference between the current stance and the broken mirror stance may appear subtle, it is important. Mirror neurons are active both when a person executes a movement and when they observe a movement. Hence, they can be considered a link between the visual and motor system. Indeed, the broken mirror account of autism focuses on the link between action observation and execution. Its key tenet is that what is broken is the link between seeing and doing. The current focus is different here. I focus on action execution, that is not on any link between seeing and doing, but on the doing itself. This assumption is neutral as to whether mirror system activity measured independently is atypical in autism. Several accounts have revealed the broken mirror theory of autism. This does not affect the current claim. Even if one assumes that the link between action observation and action execution is intact in individuals with autism, they may still exhibit atypical imitation and other socio-cognitive functions. due to the atypical movement execution and the subsequently atypical visual and motor experience. Go to section I here. Further question. Section 4b highlights that reduced similarity between autistic and non-autistic movement kinematics and anticipatory muscle activation may impact on socio-cognitive functions, i.e. biological motion categorization and imitation. Clearly, much further work is required to elucidate the link between various movement differences between autistic and typical individuals, e.g. postural control, gait, fine motor control, and of sight, and such socio-cognitive functions as intentional inferences, reading emotions from actions, estimating mental states, etc. In addition to widening the scope of this literature, there are a number of important questions that also need to be addressed by this growing research field. I had no idea it was growing. We need to check it out, mates. D. What is atypical in the social interaction between autistic and non-autistic people? The thesis outlined above supposes that impaired perception, interpretation, and prediction of a typical person's movements can arise because an autistic individual has had a lifetime of visual and motor experience with their own movements, which differ from those of typical individuals. The same applies to the typical individual who encounters an autistic person. That is, most typical individuals have little and no motor experience with autistic movement patterns. Thus, they will probably have poor representation of autistic movements and thus potential deficits in the perception, prediction, and interpretation of autistic behavior. This is an important insight. It suggests that social interaction difficulties lie not with autistic individuals themselves, but rather, with both interaction partners. The autistic person has difficulties perceiving, predicting, and interpreting the action of the non-autistic person and vice versa. This shift in focus away from autistic individuals towards the interaction between autistic and non-autistic people are consistent with recent calls to develop a second-person neuropsychiatry with an increased focus on social interaction. Well, I think you see the connection here to connectivism. The question arises whether social interactions between partners who are both autistic are more fluid, and whether such individuals show enhanced motor resonance due to greater movement similarity. A plausible alternative is that each atypical movement pattern is atypical in its own way, and therefore dissimilar to every other individual. Preliminary support for the former comes from anecdotal evidence that high-functioning individuals with autism describe social interactions with other autistic individuals to be less effortful and more efficient compared with interactions with non-autistic people. This argument also applies to the comparison of different conditions with neurological movement disorder. Further research is therefore necessary to investigate social interaction and its relationship to movement execution for autistic dyads and dyads comprising an autistic individual and an individual with a different movement disorder. Dyad is a couple. E. Are atypical movements unique to autism? The answer to this question is assuredly no. There are many conditions in which individuals exhibit movements that are different from those exhibited by typical controls, including attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, specific language impairment, SLI, Huntington's disease, Parkinson's disease, and developmental coordination disorder. Indeed, finding a movement signature that can differentiate individuals with autism from those with other conditions has become an important aim for the field due to its potential to expedite early detection. Initial studies show promise in differentiating autistic and typical children on the basis of movement patterns. However, an important goal is to be able to differentiate autistic children from those with other developmental conditions such as ADHD and SLI. Differentiating autistic movements from those exhibited by children with ADHD is perhaps the most promising avenue in this literature so far. McNeil and Mostovsky have argued that whereas both children with ADHD and autism show impairments in basic motor control, difficulties with the formation of perceptual motor action models are specific to autism. In line with this, Ament et al. Suggest that impairments in motor skills requiring the coupling of visual and temporal feedback to guide and adjust movement can differentiate ADHD, autism, and development delay. This is from McPhillis and al. Have begun to extend this line of research to other developmental conditions by comparing children with autism and SLI. However, much further work is required before a movement signature differentiating autism from other conditions can be identified. F. Are movement atypicalities in other conditions, such ADHD, associated with socio-cognitive function? That's F. If moving atypically, i.e. different from typical controls, is associated with atypical perception, prediction, and interpretation of controls movements, and if atypical movements occur in various conditions, from ADHD to Parkinson's disease. The current theory implies that individuals with these conditions might exhibit socio-cognitive atypicalities. Socio-cognitive functioning conditions including ADHD, Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease is an active area of research, and it may be the case that further work in this field uncovers atypicalities in socio-cognitive function that cut across traditional diagnostic labels. However, it should be noted that for many conditions there may be additional factors, such as attentional control and executive function deficits. Which feed into both motor control and social cognition impairments. This also applies to autism, see below. It is therefore important that future research attempts to ascertain the relative contribution of these various factors and/or uses tasks with minimal executive function, attention, and memory requirements. In studies where clinical groups are compared, the onset and duration of atypicalities matter. To give an example, if an individual has a sudden insult resulting in a typical movement, e.g. a torn ligament, this is unlikely to impact on socio-cognitive function for that individual. Their lifetime's visual and motor experience with typical movement patterns will probably outweigh the acute episode of an atypical movement. This reasoning should apply to Parkinson's disease and other movement disorders acquired in late adulthood. It is likely that the impact of atypical movements on social cognition is a functioning of the length of time one has experienced atypical movements. At present, further research is required to ascertain the influence of duration of movement atypicalities, and whether an individual's development stage at the time of onset is important. G. Are movement atypicalities the root cause of autistic cognition? Using a bottom-up explanatory framework, can atypical movements in autism be considered the root cause of autistic cognition? Such an account is likely to be too simplistic. Rather, I argue that though movement atypicalities may not explain all features of autistic behavior, the role of movements in autistic socio-cognitive function should not be overlooked. Contemporary accounts of autism suggest atypical computations that may pervade many cognitive functions from visual perception to decision making. Recent examples are the notions of atypical priors and aberrant precision of sensory information. The latter, for instance, proposes that the precision of, i.e. reliability or confidence attributed to, incoming sensory information is too high relative to the precision of prior beliefs. This account provides a compelling explanation for visual perceptual atypicalities in autism. For instance, suggesting that autistic individuals' immunity to many visual illusions may be due to abnormally high precision attributed to incoming sensory information relative to prior beliefs. In addition, wow, blew me backwards. In addition, it has been argued that this account may help to explain difficulties with social interaction due to the heavy reliance of social interaction on prior beliefs. Although the aberrant precision account has also been extended to repetitive and stereotype behaviors. Further work would be required to apply this account to the wide-ranging movement atypicalities documented in paragraph 2 of this paper. However, it is not impossible to imagine such an account. With respect to the atypicality jerky gait characteristics of autism, the ability to walk in a smooth, fluid manner is learned and refined during early development. This process can be recast within a predictive coding framework whereby prior beliefs about how to optimally move are refined according to incoming sensory information. Atypically jerky gait in autism could therefore conceivably be due to an imbalance in precision of incoming sensory information relative to prior beliefs. A final note, H. This paper has argued that visual and motor experience with own atypical movements in autism can result in the development of atypical, that is visual, and or motor representations of movements, which is likely to impact on the perception, prediction, and interpretation of others' movements. Perhaps the most interesting implication of this claim is that the same argument should be true for typical individuals. That is due to reduced experience with autistic movement. Typical individuals may exhibit deficits in the perception, prediction, and interpretation of autistic behavior. Support for this hypothesis comes from a recent study showing poor recognition of autistic emotional facial expressions by typical control observers. The real-world implication of this proposition should not be overlooked. It may be the case that many typical individuals who provide services for individuals with autism are poor at understanding the actions of their autistic service users. Thus, a final suggestion for further research is a comprehensive test of the hypothesis that typical controls exhibit poor perception, prediction, and interpretation of autistic movements and investigation in suitable training programs. Jennifer Cook, thank you very much. This is from Philosophical Transactions B, the Royal Society Publishing Organization. Jennifer Cook lives in the UK. Let me now stride into connectivism, because I think it's pertinent here. Now we stride into connectivism, and I would say something initially here. This is by Stephen Downes, the book chapter published as an introduction to connective knowledge in media, knowledge and education. But what I read earlier here, remember the Swiss robot maker, Pfeiffer, I think it was his name, that understanding is in the movement. Remember B, what I mentioned about the left and the right hemisphere, that the right hemisphere learns, it thinks, it is creative, and it's very, very hardly put into the test when we learn new difficult things. They're difficult, like learning how to drive a car, doing things with two hands, doing simultaneous action. Once it's been learned, though, it goes over to the left hemisphere and becomes something one could call a representation or a habit. There are incredible advantages to this. One is, once learned, it will be automatic. You can deliver it whenever you want to. Maybe the heart soul of Richard E. Lynn was such a thing. Once you know how to do it, you didn't even have to put an effort. It was naturally there. And maybe the heart soul is also a specific type of movement. It must have been, because it had much more predictive power. It is and always will be movements that understand. We have that already from fractality, which is C. And there's another interesting thing apart from ABC here. The other aspect is that autism could be dyadic. It is not the person that is autistic only, or this ego self idea that we usually have, that I have everything, my things that I have are coming from me, I inhabit them, so to speak. But it's in the interaction what we can't really observe, and it's a point there, and we ignore that, and that is connectivism. And we usually think, and this is a problem especially in the West, by taking away the self, not being an individual, like in Japan and Korea with Confucianism, it's assumed that the individual becomes weaker. I know 100% that is not the case. It's just the opposite. It's our fixation with singularity. We think that we can achieve individuality by excluding. Remember the voice of the friend. This is so wrong, and it is dangerous, and this is one of the threats that Heraclitus could have stirred us away from. The idea, if I separate, make for hand and a part of myself, a part of my dyadic interactions with others, I will make myself strong. It's absolutely not the case. We mirror each other's unbeknownst to ourselves directly. And I'm 100% certain, of course they will never do such an experiments, but if you place in a culture where nobody understands your movements, it is almost like being a little bit autistic for them. This I already observed in Greece, and that is incredibly interesting. So, and connectivism has many connections also to affordances from Gibson, Chimero et al. It says that reality is both inside and outside, and that we make the inside stronger. What we know about the world is irreducibly interpreted. That is to say, we do not through our senses and cognition obtain any sort of direct knowledge about the world, but rather interpret the sensations we receive. This is true not only of connective knowledge, but of all three types of knowledge. Consider qualities, for example. We take it as a basic or atomic that a statement like this apple is red represents a pure and unadjusted fact. However, looking at this more closely tells us how much we have added to our original sensation in order to arrive at this fact. First of all, the apple itself has no inherent color. Color is a property, specifically the wavelength of light reflecting off the apple. In different colored light, the apple will appear to us differently. It appears white in red light, for example, or gray in diminished light, like dusk. Yet, we say that the apple is red, standardizing our color descriptions to adapt to the natural light that surrounds us day to day. Second, our perception of the apple as red depends on our organizing light patterns in a certain way. When I was a child, the spectrum had 6 colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. As an adult, I find that a 7th, indigo, has been added. It's not that a new color came into existence when I was 20. It is that our nomenclature changed. In similar way, we can divide the colors of the spectrum in numerous ways. Red, for example, can include shades as varied as crimson and cherry, or why not FF0000. And third, when we say the apple is red, we are drawing on our prior linguistic ability to use the word apple and red correctly and apply them to appropriate circumstances. Indeed, our prior knowledge often shapes our perception themselves. Were you shown an apple in diminished light so that all you could see was gray and asked what color it was, you would still respond red because of your prior expectations about apples and redness. Less intuitively so, but equally clearly, interpretation applies to quantitative knowledge as well. It is easy to say that a sentence like, "There are 20 school children in the yard," is a basic fact. But this all depends on how you classify school children. Suppose, unknown to us all, one of the children has just been expelled. Is our statement now false? Obviously so. Perhaps one of them is over 16. Is this person still a child, and hence a school child? It depends on your point of view. Quantification is essentially the enumeration of members of a category or set. Consequently, it depends crucially on how that set is defined. But membership in a set, in turn, is typically based on the properties or qualities of the entities in question. So such membership is based on interpretation, and hence so is counting. One might be tempted to say that even though applied instances of counting are based on interpretation, mathematics itself is not. But in my view, this too would be mistaken. For one thing, people such as Mill and Kitcher argue the rules of mathematics depend on empirical verification for their importance. We say that 1 + 1 is 2, not out of the same innate sense of goodness, but because when we put one sheep together with another, we observe that there are two. Nothing but our observation prevents us from saying that 1 + 1 is 3, and in some contexts such a statement makes perfect sense. Emergence is a hard concept, but at this point I can gloss it with a simple characterization. Emergence is interpretation applied to connections. There are two equally valid ways of thinking about this. First, we may perceive an actual set of connections linking a group of entities as a distinct whole. For example, when one domino topples another, and so on in turn, we observe this from a distance. We may observe what appears to be a wave moving through the dominoes. The wave that we observe can be said to be an emergent phenomenon. It is not a property of the dominoes themselves, or even of the falling of the dominoes, but of the connectedness of the falling. Because one domino causes the next to fall, we see a wave. Second, we may perceive something as a distinct whole and interpret this as a set of connections. For example, when we look at the image of Richard Nixon on television, we do not perceive the individual pixels, but rather the image of a person. But our inference goes beyond merely the observation of the person. If asked, we would say that the appearance of the pixels are connected to each other through the mechanism of having a common origin, Richard Nixon himself, and the mechanism of video broadcasting. Emergence is fundamentally the result of interpretation. As mystics and Spinoza are fond of arguing, everything is connected. At a certain point, as the old saying goes, when a butterfly flaps its wings in China, the result is a thunderstorm in Halifax. But broadcasters in Halifax do not watch butterflies in China in order to predict the weather. But this connection will be of no use to them. Typically, they will look at more intermediate events, themselves emergent properties, such as waves of air moving through the atmosphere, known locally as cold fronts. In the same way, the observation of sets of connections between entities depends on a great deal on what we already believe. This is why we see swans in clouds or faces on Mars, when manifestly there are none. We have brought our prior knowledge of connected entities to bear on our interpretations of these phenomena. As Hume would say, our perception of causal relationship between two events is more a matter of custom and habit than it is of observation. Physicality. We generally think of knowledge as being about facts, and about facts in turn as being grounded in and independent reality, a physical reality. Consequently, it is natural for us to say, for example, that when we see that something is red, that there is a physical basis for that statement, that even if we bring some interpretation to bear, there is some physical fact or matter that makes the apple red and not blue. Certainly, we are not to think of things this way. We would be hard pressured to say anything about anything. Physicality provides us with substrate on which to hang our interpretations. As Kant would say, a necessary condition for the possibility of perception. Physicality, moreover, offers us means of sorting between what might be called correct interpretations or misperceptions, between reality and a mirage. All this may be the case, but nonetheless, there is nothing in our interpretations that is inherently based in physical reality, and hence nothing that precludes our discussion on them without reference to this foundation. Indeed, this has been enormously useful in other domains. Despite the empirical basis of mathematics, it is much more productive and useful to refer to quantity without reference to the physical entities being counted. To, in other words, think of quantity in the abstract. The same is true of quality. Thinking of quality in the abstract leads to Aristotle's syllogism and the basis of categorical reasoning. Moreover, non-physical entities may have or be attributed properties that are themselves, on this theory, based on physical properties. In our ideas and dreams, we think of vivid colors and large numbers, and these ideas are transferable. Consider the concept of purple prose, an expression which in all cases either meaningless or false, yet of significant utility and meaning. What is to be learned from this? That the entities of various categories of knowledge, be they properties or numbers, are themselves not real. When we talk about redness, we are not talking about something that has independent concrete existence in the world, but rather it is something that exists insofar as it exists at all, only in our own minds. When we talk about the number 4, we are not describing some Platonic entity, but rather nothing more than our own thoughts or sensations. That does not make them less real. Our perception of the color red is as real as any phenomenon in the world. It is merely to distinguish between the perception, which results from a complex of factors, from the physical entity, which is ostensibly caused it. In a similar manner, our interpretations of connections is distinct from the actual set of interactions that may exist in the world. Consider, for example, conspiracy theories, the postulation of a complex and interrelated set of people and events leading to the conclusion that someone is out to get you. Such theories notoriously have no basis in the physical world, but they may nonetheless be contemplated and discussed and passed along as though they were real, and the experience of a conspiracy theory may be, to the perceiver, every bit as real to the person having the experience. There is a tendency on part of the readers, whether talking about crickets or of Shirky talking about power laws, to represent connection as something natural and real that is simply out there. as though what is said about the networks of connections represents some immutable law of nature. Quite the converse is the case. Our understanding of the existence of connections and the nature of the network they form is something we bring to the table, an interpretation of what we think is salient. Salience and inference. Our knowledge consists of interpretation of perceptions, which are themselves distinct from any physical reality that may have caused them. In this sense, one might say that these interpretations are constructed, that is, they are the result of some mental or cognitive process, rather than something that comes delivered to us already assembled. Inference is, broadly speaking, the manipulation of these bits of knowledge in the abstract to produce new bits of knowledge. In our mind, for example, we can postulate that if a red light is added to a yellow light, the result would be an orange light. Or that 2 sheep added to 2 sheep will result in 4 sheep. Often subsequent perception will confirm such predictions, thus leading us to rely more greatly on the manipulation that resulted in them, and less greatly on manipulations that did not result in them, though the human mind is notoriously fickle in this regard. All such inferences, however, are the result of a complex process of selecting what might be called the most salient data. The counting of sheep, for example, is of utility only to people who own sheep, who are reading philosophy papers. Normally, during the course of our everyday lives, we have little need to count sheep, and so for the most part, we ignore the actual numbers of sheep present to us at any given time. In a similar manner, when we perceive an orange light, we do not typically view it as a confirmation of the idea that red and yellow make orange. Unless we are visual artists, we see it merely as an instance of orange. Our inference, therefore, are based on salience, where salience may be thought of as the importance, relevance, or vivacity of some property or perception. We pick out those perceptions that will be of use to us and disregard the rest. This is not often even a conscious process. It is based in part on innate reactions, such as jumping when we hear a loud sound, and largely on prior expectations. Our past knowledge has led us to recognize that something that looks and sounds like a tiger is something that we should pay attention to. And so our inference engine kicks into a higher gear. In the same way, some connections are more salient than others. Think about your sense of place or location. It is centered on the city or town in which you are located. The streets spreading out from your pattern unique to your position. Change your location and your map of the world changes with it. Walmart, which was once 2 blocks away, is now 1 block away. Or consider your circle of friends. Again, you are at the center, with your closest associates at near proximity, with acquaintances more distance. Your friend, however, will count a different set of people as being most proximate, and others, including some of you hold more close, as more distant. Things become even more complex when considering the mind. We know that the mind is a massively connected set of neurons, but where is the point of view from which we regard these connections? While we can consider the bird's eye view in the abstract and speak dispassionately about the hippocampus or the corpus callosum, we cannot adopt such a frame of reference with respect to our own thinking. And yet it seems manifest that there is a point of view with which we regard our own mind. It is the essence of conscious thought, that we are aware of our mental processes at the same time we are having them. And again, it is that which is most salient that comes to the fore here. You may have mental representations of hundreds or even thousands of people, but if you are not armored, be thinking only about one. Your body consists of millions of nerve ends, but if you have a toothache, your attention is focused only on those few related to the tooth. In a similar manner, it's only your most active and your most consistent thoughts that intrude on your consciousness. And it's through the lens of those thoughts that you interpret phenomena, and through phenomena that you have those thoughts. Inference is the observation of salient similarities among thoughts and perceptions. It is the recognition of common properties, qualities, quantities, and connections among varied perceptions, and the consequent drawing of connections between those entities and between other properties of those entities. Seeing that 2 sheep and 2 sheep make 4 sheep, you are led via the salience of quantity and newly found salience of cows to contemplate the idea that 2 cows and 2 cows might make 4 cows. Well, this is a pointer also to the analytical philosophy that tries to ground everything in a solid reality. That will make people, I think, disconsider the connectivism of everything, meaning, information, and such. So standing too much on one leg will disrupt your balance in understanding the world. And this is, I would say, an inherent mistake within analytical philosophy or reductive realism. It, oddly enough, brings you away from reality. And interconnectedness and connectivism show directly where the problem lies. It's the singular view, the myopic view on an arche or an origin that blocks your possibility of being open, free, and understanding. And I would say that's a bodily thing. And possibly being an analytical philosopher is an impairment in the bodily movement. I'm quite certain of that. They don't live in their bodies, so their movement, it doesn't inform their reality. And they don't live with others, and therefore they are less of individuals. And that will also strengthen the possibility that they seem on the surface to share the same signified, whereas in fact it doesn't signify at all the same, because as I see, being able to point something needs to bring in the whole world. Just as Heraclitus said, fire can only signify when it includes everything. Sky, air, water, all is in with fire, and that can truly signify, whereas the Saussurean signifier cannot signify anything. It's empty because of the stance of Saussure. And Saussure developed his lack of understanding in context with other people who reacted, mirror-sensed his lacking of understanding real world. It explains so much. Sometimes when I had professors in analytic philosophy and logic, their bodily sense was eerie, to say the least. It was cumbersome, mysterious, sometimes frightening. They did not seem to be of this world to a certain extent. And I think that was the foundation for their philosophy in some sense, half of it, not all of it. Because only speaking of connectivism will undermine connectivism, you see? But it's an opening up of everything. It makes it possible to have a further larger view of reality that takes in your relaxation, your possibility to breathe freely, to be a happy human being, to move with others, and they will directly react to you, understand you. It's a sort of liking and love. And I always felt with Tencho and others there was a lack of love in the bodily movement. And that reflected in the others, and then in that third turn reflected on the person, to becoming even more or less learning about reality. But it's a fixatedness, and it actually sort of contradicts their mission, but it doesn't really, because of course the world is a whole and not a whole. That was extremely interesting. I say thank you very much. Sheer pleasure. So glad I found this article. I will now go home to look further what I can find. Bye bye for now. Thirsty I am. Completely dry.